Hello and welcome in to Heartfelt Consciousness. I'm Michelle Young and I'm here with Angie Tiwari, and we're going to be talking today about inclusion in the yoga space and how we can respectfully integrate traditional ancient wisdom teachings into our yoga practice and also our offerings. Welcome in, Angie. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to get started, to take a moment to learn a little bit more about you. So I'd love for you to share a little bit of your background with our listeners and a little bit about your practice.
Yeah, of course. So I feel like, where do I begin? Going way back, when I was, I think, about 3 years old, my mum started teaching me and my sister, who was a couple of years older, certain pranayam, certain asana, certain chants that have kind of followed me throughout my life. I'm Indian Hindu on both sides, and so a lot of the bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, of love, and the physical practice and the breathing, and then even just Ayurveda as well, which is often known as the sister science of yoga, is very rooted in with my upbringing and my culture, and actually that of a lot of Indian families across the world, not just based in India. I was born and brought up in the UK. So that's when I first, I guess, experienced yoga. And fast forward to when I was about 18 or 19, I started going to gyms and I would see yoga on the timetable. But when I did yoga at home with my mum and even, grandparents teaching you chanting and things like that, it was never, now we're going to do an hour of yoga, or now we're going to do a 45-minute vinyasa flow. It was more focused on individual poses and individual techniques, and the duration of time was not so something we fixated on. I think it really is now in the West. We look at, it's not actually beneficial unless it's half an hour or an hour, and it's not true at all. We're always doing just as what we can fit in the day and what we managed to do. And when I discovered it in the gyms, I just didn't see how it was the same thing that was connected to my culture, because it was all about the flexibility. It was all about the mobility. I didn't see any teachers that looked like me. I didn't see different people in the studio or the gym that looked like me, or even that looked like the people that were walking the streets in the area of where these gyms and studios were. And so from about 18, honestly, till about 30-ish, maybe like 29, 30, I felt a little bit something was missing, but I couldn't really pinpoint what it was. And I read a book in 2020 called Natives by Akala, and that just changed a lot for me. And it really opened my eyes to the systemic racism in this country, the issues that different communities have experienced. And I guess it made me really aware of, oh, the yoga industry has become quite toxic, which is really ironic because yoga is not that. And I know the yoga industry is really amazingly welcoming to so many people. But if you feel that way, it's probably because you're not from one of these communities that feels excluded from it. And so I then kind of set on a mission. I was already teaching yoga by that point. I'd fallen in love with yoga. I went to India. I did my training. I trained in Ashtanga to deepen my own practice. I love the physical side of yoga as much as I love the other elements, but that was what really drew me in. And when I had this epiphany, I guess, in 2020, and kind of towards the end of that year, I thought, no, I really want to do what I can and do my bit to make everyone feel included and welcome. And that's in the language we use, and it's in the spaces we create, and it's in the styles that we teach. And so that's when I started doing the work that I do now, which is decolonizing yoga. What does that actually mean? Trying to explain that to people, but also trying to do it in a way that doesn't make people feel like they've done something wrong and they're blamed and they're shamed. Because I don't believe that any good stuff, any work, any education happens. We have to empower people. And what I do is really try and empower people to be like, maybe I did say this word incorrectly, or maybe I did only include this group of people into my class, but now I'm going to do better because I know X, Y, Z. So that's kind of a very quick whistle stop tour as to where it all started, and I guess why I feel so passionate about it.
That's amazing. And definitely so many good points to consider. I think that, there's a lot of conversations being started and over the last maybe 10 years or so, we're seeing more and more of these conversations. started about, like how to remain authentic to the roots of these wisdom teachings and how to really incorporate them into your life in an authentic way. For me, the physical practice is not really yoga at all. I'm a yana yogi, and so I'm constantly asking myself why I'm attached to what I'm attached to, constantly going back to the sutras, constantly evaluating my values and how I'm living in the world, and am I actually putting out what is through the lens of discernment and through svadhyaya, or am I like just being, I call it irresponsible with my energy, right? And so I'm so curious to learn a little bit more about how decolonizing yoga impacts the physical practice, especially since a lot of the work that Krishnamacharya did during colonization was to revamp or reinstate yoga asana as a practice and get people excited about it again because of the experience of colonization that had been going on for hundreds of years. So I'm really curious, when I talk about colonization in yoga, I remind people that the yoga we practice right now is colonized, and there's not a lot we can do about it because traditional yoga is a seat and meditation, and that those pranayama, those kriyas, those cleansing practices that prepare the body and the mind for that union state, that state of samadhi, of turiya. So I'm curious to know, how do you reconcile and educate on decolonization and yoga when really warrior one, Virabhadrasana one, is a colonized posture?
Complex thing because yoga's been around for so many centuries. And you're right, when we look back and we look at the ancient texts, most of the poses that we see today, your warriors, are the Chandrasana half moon pose, headstands, handstands, a lot of them. And also you look at styles. So you've got Ashtanga and Hatha, which were talked about relatively quite a while ago, not way back when, but kind of now we've got power yoga, rocket yoga, vinyasa flow, dynamic, energizing, all these different words, restorative yin, which takes into consideration Chinese medicine. And so that, I think, creates a lot of confusion for people. And I think also is it an evolution or is it a new thing that's kind of so far removed? But the issue that we have is that in the world, when people say yoga, they think the movement only. And are we going to reverse that? I actually don't know if we will, because people see meditation as so different to yoga. People will say, oh, do you do yoga? Yeah. Do you meditate? And actually the practice of yoga is the suspension of the fluctuations, the busyness of the mind. And if you said that, people would say, no, that's meditation. Stilling your mind and focusing on your becoming a master of your mind, that's meditation. Yoga is something different. But that's not true. I don't know if we can reverse all of these additional styles of yoga that have come about. One, because it's been going on for such a long time now, but two, because people are wedded to their physical practice. And, there's nothing wrong with that. If you love moving your body, there's a lot of healing and there's a lot of transformation that can take place when you're moving your physical body. I also say that yoga is a room with many, many doors. And you might come in through the door of chanting. You might come in through the door of breath work, because that's become a bit of a new age practice, what we know as pranayama. You might come in through the door of asana. It doesn't actually matter which door you come into, because I think if you go deep enough in your practice, you eventually discover the other elements and you take your practice deeper than just movement. But a lot of the work that I try and do is to educate the history of the pose. And when I say the history, you think a warrior pose and you think, oh, there's pretty new age, relatively new age when we talk about how long yoga has been around for. But the theme of warrior is all throughout yoga philosophy. The wars that happen, the conflicts that happen, the way the mind deals with those conflicts. And so I think what's really beautiful about yoga is how can we bring the old and weave it into the new? And how can we look at the poses that we do and take it deeper than just bring your knee out to the side, look at your middle finger, bring your shoulders down? How can we take it further? And that's in the language that we use with our students. It's even in things like weaving beautiful ancient Indian fables while someone's holding a pose, to connect it deeper with, you could tell a warrior story from one of the ancient texts. You could talk about the Mahabharata. There's so many different things. That obviously takes a lot more work. And I think we're living in a world where a lot of yoga teachers and yoga studios are in a supply and demand. If yoga studios put meditation, or if they put a svadhyaya class, which was, we're going to study ourselves, we're going to study some ancient texts, we're going to do that inner work, we know that they would have so few signups compared to the dynamic vinyasa. And so studios have, because it's commercialized, of course, so studios need to make money, so they're going to put on the timetable what they know attracts the most people to the practice, and that is the physical for most people. So weaving in ancient fables, I think, is great. I think using Sanskrit, I think incorporating things that aren't just the poses. You can still do a pose heavy class and go through lots of different poses, but you can incorporate chanting, you can incorporate using the language, you can incorporate a lot of other things to just bring the richness of the philosophy in. Or if you don't want to do that, you step back from teaching at that studio and you share what you feel is the true meaning of yoga. But I think the true meaning of yoga for so many people has been lost over the years.
Yeah, it's a super interesting conversation. I think it's like not something that could even be like limited to one podcast, because, everybody has a different perspective, and our perspectives are based on our lived experience. They're not universally true. And a lot of our perspectives lead us to assumptions about what we think or don't think people are or are not doing. And it's interesting, the comment about svadhyaya. We don't make money on our yoga teacher trainings. Like, that's not what we do at our studio. We're donation based, and our trainings are the least expensive literally in the country for an in-person training. But it's 100% svadhyaya, like 100%, and they are filled to the brim because people want to learn about it. And I think that, one of the things that comes up is, what is your intention as a teacher versus what is someone else's? So when we're looking at, the greater picture of yoga, it's not just this one part. Meditation isn't an action. I can't meditate. It's a state of being. It talks about that very, very explicitly in the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Hatha Pradipikita, all of it. And I know sometimes my pronunciation isn't great, but the understanding is there. It is a very rich, it's a very rich philosophical way of life. It's not something that can just be overlaid in a 60-minute class. So when we talk about, like incorporating the stories, the fables, the things like that, that is certainly some people's intention as a teacher. From my perspective, and I'm just one teacher, I'm not all the teachers, and my opinion really only represents my lived experience and my intention as a teacher. My intention as a teacher is to get people to drop out of thinking, to get people to find states of dharana, to find states of samadhi in that experience, and then take that with them and learn how to do that off the mat and in their day-to-day life. How do we, and I know it's possible, but I want to hear you speak to it. How do we do that? How do we create a container that's safe for svadhyaya, that's safe for leveraging the body as a tool to incorporate and integrate proprioceptive awareness with interoceptive awareness in a way that informs, oh, I'm judging myself for doing this thing. What if I observe this without going into thinking, and I can see both that karmic personality, that I, me, my, without being so attached to my perception of getting into crow, but really just come back to my breath, using that breath as a way to drop out of that critical thinking mind and into a state of being fully present with what is arising as it arises. How can we do that and incorporate, the cultural aspects, which, some might even say are, yes, part of yoga and also not part of yoga. It's like a double-sided coin, right? We have that side of yoga that's very introspective and has absolutely nothing to do with the outside world. And then we have that part of yoga that was born in this culture of, fighting wars, fighting off a variety of different countries and regions that were colonizing. It wasn't just the Brits, it was all over the place. So we've got Portuguese, French in there, the Ottoman Empire. It's like a huge thing. So I'm just so curious, like, because there are beautiful teachers that I love and admire that are very, very into weaving in the gods and goddesses, the Mahabharata, all of the different folklore and traditional like wisdom that was really born out of the caste system and how these people lived and breathed together, versus other teachers who are like, I just want people to come back to their breath and get out of that chitta vritti and stop all the doing. What is your perspective how we can marry those two things to create a rich offering that doesn't waterboard somebody with so much thinking that they're no longer in practice, they're no longer on their mat?
I think teachers need to be really specific with what they want to bring to, like you said, a 60-minute practice, because we can't teach the entirety of yoga in a 60-minute practice. It's impossible. I find a lot of students of mine who are yoga teachers get very worked up with, well, I want to bring in these poses, and then I need to think about the breath, and then I also need to weave in this philosophy, and then that energy of that can feel quite chaotic because there's a fear of what if I'm missing something out. That energy can be felt by students. And so I think it starts with the teacher. Be really clear on what's my one theme of the class. So let's say my one theme of the class is the concept of raga, which is attachment. And so you'll say a little bit about what raga is. So the concept of attachment, it's one of the 5 kleshas or one of the pancha kleshas, which are these concepts that we have these 5 internal sufferings of the mind. So 5 things that cause us suffering. The third one is our focus today, and that's raga. So as you move through every pose that you do, as you move through each breath practice, as you move through what's going on in your mind, be aware of what am I attached to? Because when you're aware of what you're attached to, only then can the detachment come. You can't suddenly be detached. First, you need to be aware of what is the attachment. Maybe the attachment is getting into crow pose and getting really frustrated. And then because you're trying to be aware of what you're attached to, while you're doing that, you're so aware of your attachment to having to get into the pose that you can then make that connection. But opening a class with that topic, which is just a few sentences, and you're giving them a little bit of meat for them to think, oh, five sufferings of the mind. That's quite interesting. I kind of want to know what the other few are. And maybe that student goes off and does their own research then. Maybe if you're teaching 5 classes, maybe in that month and the first week into the following month, you say, okay, this is our theme for the month, for the next 5 weeks. We're going to be focusing on this. And today we're doing this one. Is a really nice way to draw people into the philosophy, but not to overwhelm your students, but also not to overwhelm yourself with having to bring all of this information. Because also we want to leave enough space in class where we are not speaking as teachers, because then people have time to sink into what's actually going on. And it starts with the teacher. So not overwhelming yourself, bringing in a little snippet of philosophy that they can apply into every single thing that they do. And you can just keep reminding them back to that one word if you're using a word, or to that one theme if you're using a goddess, for example. Bring it back to the strength, bring it back to the nurturing if you're doing Kalima. And then I also think what starts with the teacher is the ability to not be perfect themselves. When you have people who come to yoga, generally speaking, especially beginners, they think it's all about the flexibility, and therefore they equate not being flexible, wobbling and falling over equals I'm not good at it. And this perfectionism rises within us all. And especially if we're not very self-aware, that can really take over. A teacher that stands at the front of the mat and isn't afraid to wobble themselves or have a little laugh with their students and make people feel seen is going to make the beginners, or the people that are just feeling a little bit wobbly that day, know that I'm allowed to do this. And that takes into our external life of, I can slip up, I can make mistakes. It's okay. So it all starts with the teacher, and we need to not overwhelm ourselves, but we also need to go to class somewhat prepared. I don't think you need to necessarily plan a whole class, this pose, this pose, this pose, this pose. I don't work that way, but a rough idea of what you think your students will tune into and what you'd like to bring to them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Is I agree with you. I don't plan my classes. I don't think I've ever sequenced a class. I have a system and I use the system and I feel the energy and then we go from there. But it's so interesting as we're talking, and I mentioned earlier my husband has a linguist background, and I have taught English and history for decades, on top of teaching philosophy and yoga in trainings and all the things. It's so interesting how languaging does make such a big deal. Especially when young teachers or new teachers, I shouldn't say young teachers, but newer teachers come in and they're like, well, what am I supposed to do with this particular concept or this particular sequence, or how am I supposed to guide students when they ask me this question about discernment, or when they ask me this question about attachment versus non-attachment. And it's so interesting how language plays such a huge role in our ability to connect with one another. One of my teachers is Nashala Joy Devi. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. Nishala, I always say her name wrong. But she is a monk. She lived with Swami Satyananda for about 35 years in his ashram and was one of his teachers for that ashram community. And she teaches on some of this languaging. She talks about how challenging it is because you cannot translate Sanskrit directly into English. It's not possible. There's not a single direct translation. So for example, with this concept of attachment and non-attachment, right? Well, what is, and I'm going to say it wrong, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I always joke with people about this. I have it tattooed on 3 places of my body because it's such an important concept. Viagra. How do you pronounce it for me correctly?
Vairaga.
Okay, I'm always a little bit cautious because of the other V word that sounds similarly to that word that is not a yoga word. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, I have this word tattooed everywhere because the way that she helped me to really understand this was she was like, it's like having a glass of water. It's not that the water is clear, but I hold the water up to, a pink surface. I wish I had a clear thing here I could show you. And it becomes pink, or I hold it up to your shirt and it becomes black. I hold it up to, a leaf and it becomes green. It's on what it is holding space for, but does not internalize that. So when we use these words, I mean, you and I are having conversation as colleagues and yoga practitioners and teachers, but when you're talking to the lay person or the person who's just coming to it, and we're having these conversations, how do we ensure that we're conveying the meaning appropriately in a way that isn't, like very like harsh, and actually divorcing the nuance of the word itself? Because I used to say a lot about detachment, attachment versus detachment, but detachment is apathy to some people, not to everybody, but to some people it's apathetic. Whereas this other concept of non-attachment is a holding without an internalization. It's like the ultimate form of compassion in the sense that I can hold space for it, but not become it, not misidentify as that thing, which Patanjali talks about in Samadhi Pada. So I'm curious to know your perspective on that. And, again, it's not a perfect world and we are going to make mistakes, and there is a safety in having dialogue and having conversation around it. I know I struggle with that personally as an educator, both in yoga and in other things as well. But I'm curious to know how you feel about that.
I totally understand where you're coming from. And I think that there's 2 things here. The first thing is that the narrative has, I've heard, been exclude all of the ancient stuff and the words that people aren't familiar with, because if you include them, then people are going to feel excluded because they don't understand what you're talking about. And I just completely disagree with that, because I don't think, the definition of appropriating someone's culture is to cherry pick what you think people want and then discard the rest. And so the second point I wanted to make is it's the way you do it. And you just said there that when you have a group of students, and I do exactly the same as you read the energy in the room and you feel what needs to happen. And I think it does take a while to get into that. So if you're a brand new yoga teacher and you think, how can I just walk into a room, lead a class and not know what I'm doing, that probably feels really overwhelming. It definitely would have felt overwhelming to me when I trained, but it just becomes habit, and it then is just my personal preferred way of teaching. But I will read the energy of the person, and if you're a good communicator, you can then suss out just how you would explain a story to somebody. You can figure out, how does this person need me to explain that story in a way that still conveys the underlying message. And you can throw in a word of Sanskrit and you can explain the loose translation of what this means. And then I also think telling a personal story is really empowering. When I've heard teachers tell me something that happened in their life and connect it with a philosophical concept, I've always remembered it more because I've heard it in the form of a story. It's been more empowering to me. It's made me more inquisitive with my own self. So, for example, one of the first reasons I realized yoga is really making such a big difference off the mat is you watch how you were thinking to respond, and you correct that response, and then you realize that you've just changed the whole course of how a situation could have turned out. So I remember I was cycling with my husband in the mountains years ago, my boyfriend at the time, now husband, and he was way ahead of me because he is an avid cyclist and I was not. And I was a little bit nervous because we were on a road, and he was quite a bit ahead of me, but he was calling back saying, "You okay? Do you need anything?" And I was like, yeah, I'm fine. And I watched within me this frustration, this feeling annoyed, this, at him. And that could have easily, if I hadn't have become aware of that and course corrected it, become, when we next stopped, an argument saying, why were you so far ahead and you were so much faster than me? And like, why didn't you slow down, or whatever it was? But in that cycle ride, I had that second voice that said, isn't that interesting? You're getting really annoyed. He's not actually doing anything wrong. He's cycling at his pace. He's saying, do you want me to slow down? So he's actually offering that support. And it's your perfectionism that wants to be, up there and as quick as him. But he's not actually doing anything wrong. So the anger and the frustration, it's being aware of those emotions and registering them, and then not allowing them to continually play out like a long movie, which is what a lot of us like to do. It's that chitta vritti, it's that the mind waves, the mental chatter. And that was such a prominent time for me, because by the time we got to where we were trying to get and I got off the bike, I felt fine because I had recognized that I'm feeling these emotions that are living within me. I want to project them onto someone. He's the person in front of me that I would like to project them onto. But actually, it doesn't need to be that way. And so that is the yoga in practice for me. It's the moments off the mat where I have those revelations and that higher sense of awareness. And I think when you tell a story like that, people think, oh, that's so cool. Because I used to think that you couldn't interrupt your thoughts. You are your thoughts. And saying you're not your thoughts and be more aware, it's very hard for people to suddenly register that. I certainly would find that a very confusing thing to say. What do you mean I'm not? Well, then who's saying these things if it's not me? I didn't understand it. And a lot of the philosophy really does go over your head. And some of it still does go over my head. And then you reread it and you reread it. And then there's one moment where it will just stick when I guess you're ready to absorb the information. So I think you can still communicate in a way that's respectful and that educates people about the roots and the culture, but in a way that you know that person is going to understand. We're not teaching inclusive yoga if we're trying to bring all of the really complex long terms and terminology without breaking it down in a way that is easy to understand. And you can still do that without diluting the practice and diluting the meaning of it. So you're still being respectful, but you're still making that person feel like, oh, okay, that's so interesting. Maybe I'm not there yet, but that's quite cool that you can do that all from yoga. I didn't realize that before.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think one of the things that I learned very early on was there's a difference between educating and instructing. Anybody can throw together a sequence. The educational piece is continuing to weave in like the history, the philosophy, the language, the culture, etc. To what degree you do it to, I think is everyone's own, it's based on discernment. It's based on what they're capable of, what their intention is as a teacher. And how their experience can support that. I think one of the things that is really, really interesting about the conversation that we're having is that, and Leslie Kaminoff and I had this conversation the last time I was out at lab with him gosh, when was it? It was October, November. He said, we've got all of these organizations like the alliances, the international associations, etc., trying to, provide scaffolding for yoga. But what is it to be like a yoga educator, like to truly educate on the multifaceted aspects of yoga? And you're right, you can't just do it in a 60-minute class. It's little breadcrumbs, it's little tiny pieces of, opportunity. I also wanted to touch base on appropriation because I love the way you say this, and I teach this every single time I teach a YTT. People love to throw that term around, and I'm like, appropriation is when you cherry pick from a culture and you have no idea what it is that this represents or where it comes from, and you're not using it in context. Like, and I get pretty snarky with people in St. Patrick's Day about it, because it's a beautiful example of appropriation. There was never an intention with St. Patrick to drink green beer and party. That was not part of the equation, but we decided to capitalize on this as an opportunity to make money, have fun, to serve someone else's agenda. When we do that with yoga, that is appropriation. So we have to be very, very, very clear as to what I'm teaching is authentic to me. It's in my practice. It's something that I not only have a personal and intimate relationship with, but I also have done the research, not only through books, but through conversations like this, through relationships, through travel, etc., to have an immersive experience that gives me a more complex and whole perspective on where this came from, how you apply it, how it's applied a variety of different ways in different households too. I have at least, 20 dozen, Indian friends from all over the subcontinent, and they all practice a little bit differently. One of them didn't even know what the sutras was until I taught her about the sutras, whereas another one, her husband and son chant the sutras every single day at 4:30 in the morning. So it's vastly different experiences based on where they were, raised, how they were raised, what their, socioeconomic status was. It's a luxury sometimes to be able to immerse yourself in these types of things, especially if you're trying to make ends meet and put food on the table. So even people who are of the descent of the culture sometimes do not have access to the wisdom teachings and the integrative practices that really yield these states of being and this expanded awareness and access to compassion, etc. So I think that the mission that you're on is really important because it does span so many different, so many different types of people, whether they are from the West or not. There really is a need for more education and less like choreography, right? Less, throwing something out there for entertainment. It really is a way of life. And that's my pitta in me, is I just get very like, again, I need to work on that attachment. I get very attached to, maintaining the integrity of the practices and the life, that we have when we are immersed in a practice like this. So I'm super interested to hear about the way that you package this education to reach a diverse group of people. I know you work with teachers and students alike. Tell me a little bit more about the offerings that you have to support this global education as it relates to the history, the philosophy, the language, et cetera, and the mission, ultimately the mission of inclusivity. Because when I think back to our lineage, which is Krishnamacharya, I feel like, Krishnamacharya was one of the first people who allowed women to practice. This is something that, again, inclusivity is allowing everybody to come, to the practice. So I'm really excited to hear more about your offerings and how you're making this accessible to people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I share lots on social media, which is just free for everyone to access, short snippets, little bits of history. And I kind of start with the tagline of, I accidentally appropriated my own culture, and now I teach you how to not make the same mistakes as me. Because, for years I didn't really clock what deep down I'd felt wasn't quite right. And for years I just did movement and I hadn't really gone deeper and explored deeper, which is speaking to your point around, a lot of Indian families do grow up with this, but we also can't look at someone and assume that that person knows more than that person. And I like that you're sharing cultural appropriation and the actual meaning of that, because often the wrong thing gets thrown about and it's very damaging. You clearly have a huge amount of education that you've done, and someone's skin color, we shouldn't discredit that just because that person's not from the culture. A lot of my work is in actually uplifting the Indian yoga teachers who do know what they're talking about, so that there's more representation and so that you feel seen. But no way is cultural appropriation just saying you can only teach or practice if you're from the culture, and it's often misunderstood as that. So I like that you're sharing what it actually is. But yeah, lots of information on social media, which is free. I'll always put videos on my YouTube, which are also free, and a mix of classes and some education bits. There's a playlist called Yoga Teacher Tips. And then I do in-person retreats. So that's a lovely way to just go a little bit deeper in your practice. And online 50-hour yoga teacher training, which is coming up new. It's called Rooted in Respect. It's all about inclusion, diversity, ethics, making sure that you are using the correct language to everyone in class, spotting your own. I think one of the things we're not very good at doing is understanding our own privilege, because it's a bit of an awkward thing to do, but everyone has privilege, and understanding it and understanding our biases. Like you were saying earlier, everything in life that we think, the whole universe revolves around us, and everything that we do and our opinions is all shaped by what we know. But who are we surrounding ourselves with? And are we just having one tunnel vision view on it? And just the ability to unlearn and open up and educate is going to mean that when you do have people in your classes who look a little bit different, you're not sat there thinking, I should give an easier option to that person because I don't know if that person would be able to do it because perhaps they're in a bigger body. Because that is a perfect example of making someone feel excluded, but with a lens that it probably all stems with unintentional harm. You probably think you're helping that person out by putting a few blocks next to their mat, but maybe they feel really singled out, and actually they're perfectly fine without doing the pose, without using the props. Let's put props in front of everyone's mats rather than just single one person out. So I think things like that we can very easily miss because we go about our way in our class and we're maybe used to seeing the same types of people coming in. Those are the kind of things we're going to be debunking. How to weave philosophy in lots of ways that's really easy to understand, that doesn't have to make you feel overwhelmed as a teacher, and that makes the students actually grasp what that concept is and invite them to maybe go deeper in their spare time or in the next class. So the 50-hour training is coming up. And then we also have Respecting Yoga's Culture, which is just a 2-hour workshop, and they're both online. So it's a nice little taster if you're not ready to do a training this year. But those are the offerings that I have. And I love doing this work. I love sharing this work. I used to feel quite awkward and uncomfortable about it, but I feel like over the years, hearing people say they feel more included and thank you for doing the work, I know it's so important as part of my mission to do it. So I feel empowered in doing it now.
I love it. And you do such a beautiful job at it, at holding the space, at having the hard conversations. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to connect with you in this way because, I have a lot of these conversations out off of the podcast, right? With either colleagues, friends, students, teachers, et cetera. And it's so interesting, how people get really uncomfortable having these conversations. I love them because they do challenge our perspective and they help us to come back to
Mm,
something that is, I think, more intrinsic. It's our intrinsic wholeness. And I may mess up and I may think I'm being inclusive and not quite be inclusive, but ultimately that too is just an opportunity to expand my consciousness and grow as an individual and a teacher. I'm
yeah.
really excited. I'd actually love to talk to you offline about maybe having you come do the workshop in the community on the platform, because we definitely need more representation and conversations around these things specifically. And with everything, I mean, I know you're in the UK right now, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
In the US, we've got our own host of issues going on, but
Mm,
a lot of, either people with very open and expansive, like it's not so much that their consciousness is so open, but they're open to opening it, right? And then a
yeah.
lot of people are like, nope, my way's the highway. If you don't want to get on, then get off, and that is like a super challenging position to be in,
Mm,
from a cultural perspective, because both sides tend to, in that grasping, and again, this all goes back to the sutras, in the
yeah.
grasping of the kleshas. I love the way that Desikachar and Krishnamacharya talk about them as like they're all avidya. It's all avidya, just different forms of
Yeah.
ignorance. But in that grasping, we forget that there is so much more than this perspective of I, me, mine. So I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. I wish we had even more time to chat, but I do want to be respectful of your time. And again, I highly recommend taking a look. What's your handle on social media,
It's
Angie?
my surname, which is Tiwari, and then yoga. And that's the same on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And then tiwariyoga.com is the website. And I want to add as well that you're right. It's the ego, the ahankara that wants to keep us safe. And so when the ego comes up, a lot of us feel awkward about having the conversations. But when you understand that if you can kind of stand down, you can no one's attacking you. You don't need to put this defense. You get so much more out of it because you open your knowledge and you open that center of welcome. Let me allow it in. I don't need to stand up with the weapons ready to fight. I think that's a really key thing, and hopefully helps more people feel like, if I feel awkward about this, I'm sure many other people do, but I'm ready to learn.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I love this. Well, thank you so much, Angie, for being here and for sharing. Do you have a website where people can check out these offerings and register?
Yeah, so it's tiwariyoga.com. So the same handle that's my socials and then .com, and you'll find all the retreats, the yoga teacher training, the workshops, everything on there, and also my online yoga studio. So that's all Indian teachers, over 350 classes, and it's on demand, pre-recorded content. So we've got lots of students all over the world, which is wonderful.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm so glad to be able to highlight you today. Y'all check it out, tiwariyoga.com. We'll have all the information in the description. Thank you so much, Angie, for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care.